Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome to the Science Gallery and to our What If exhibition. This afternoon we're going to have a conversation with the two curators of What If, who are Tony Dunne and Fiona Raby, both from the Department of Design Interactions at the RCA in London. Tony Dunne and Fiona Raby also have their own design consultancy, Dunne and Raby. They have worked with the Science Gallery to bring this exhibition that you see in the gallery to life, which is has just been open now for a couple of days. And I hope that if you haven't already been around the exhibition, that you'll have a chance to do so after this afternoon's conversation. But really what today is about is to try and sort of tease out some of the ideas behind the exhibition and also behind the kind of design that you can see in the exhibition, and some of which is design created by Tony and Fiona, but also includes work by a total of 20 designers, many of whom have come through the Design Interactions program in the RCA, and some of whom are now working in various other areas. And I'd really like to start, Tony, by asking you, if I might, can you say what's the idea behind the What If exhibition?
I guess there are a few ideas. The main idea would be how designers are starting to get involved with research being done in the science world. And that's one side of it. The other side is looking at how science and technology, particularly the research that's been done on science, is impacting on our everyday lives. And we wanted to sort of, on the one hand, show all the very different ways that designers can work with scientists. You've got something like Nellie's experiments with dark matter, where she's trying to recreate historic science experiments in her home. Something like Sasha's Futures project, the Golden Institute of Energy, where he's looking at what happens if, historically, if a particular government in America had embraced fairly radical scientific thinking during the 80s, how today might be different. And then others that are fast-forwarding, looking at what the implications of some of the research being done in areas like genetics today the impact it might have on our lives. So it's sort of trying to provide glimpses of different ways that designers can engage with some of the work being done in the science world, really, I think. And the idea, I guess, behind the title, What If, is that we felt that's the sort of unifying theme, really. As you'll see from the exhibition, the work is pretty diverse. But what seems to unite them all is that nearly every project is asking some kind of a question through design. What if such and such a technology was to become real? How might it impact us, etc.? So that was probably the most difficult thing, was to find some way of unifying all of this stuff.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of what we're seeing in the exhibition, we're looking at future scenarios, we're looking at possible futures, we're looking at dreams and nightmares enabled by technology. But there's also a very strong sense of humour injected in what's going on here. I mean, I think, for example, of Nellie Ben Ayoun's armchair space tourism, or creating the Large Hadron Collider in your kitchen sink, or Thomas Twaite's extraordinary journey to make a toaster at the cheapest Argos toaster completely from scratch. And even to the extent of getting iron ore and smelting it and so on. You mentioned the other night when there was an event with some of the designers that it was almost design stand-up comedy. And I wonder, why is humour so important to this work?
That's a really good question, but a really difficult one to answer. It sort of emerges. And it emerges again in a lot of different ways. I mean, you mentioned some examples there, but there's kind of satire, there's outright comedy in the form of certainly Nellie's project. There's sort of performance, as Nellie's projects involves a lot of performance. That's very humorous in itself. But I think the humour primarily sort of breaks down boundaries. A lot of the work, the topics they're dealing with are pretty complex. And the ideas behind the projects are pretty serious and in some cases quite provocative. And I think humour somehow provides a sort of a way into the project. It sort of somehow, I don't know, people can see something quite humane behind all this kind of technological front. And I think there's also another aspect to it. A lot of the designers are quite passionate about, I guess, particular roles for design. They believe that society should change in certain ways, and that design can help bring about those changes. And there's a real danger of maybe coming across as a preacher or an evangelist. And I think humour, again, sort of subverts that slightly, and rather than directing messages at people, somehow draws people into these kind of slightly absurd, playful worlds, and maybe facilitates a more kind of, generous interaction with the ideas. But often amongst ourselves, we do talk about the humour in the work and where does it come from. And it just seems to emerge, really.
Yeah. I also think it can sort of point to things that perhaps are a little bit difficult, that if you just said them straight off, might be more uncomfortable. So if you kind of suggest ideas that are more difficult to deal with, I think humour, you can think about them and be aware of them, but you don't have them in your face. So I think that's another reason that humour plays quite an interesting part, because you can be quite provocative with the humour as a tool.
It's difficult, though, because although I said the other night that we could have a design stand-up comedy evening, I think most of the humour works pretty well, but it's hard to deal with it so it doesn't just become pure comedy or a kind of design joke. And there's very little theory on how you manage humour, I think, in art and design. And it's quite interesting that it has to be done almost experimentally. You have to try this stuff out, see what the reaction is, try and reflect on how it's working as humour, and then learn on that. And sometimes it definitely goes wrong and becomes a little bit too jokey. And we try to sort of steer it into this maybe more ambiguous space where it's not always obvious that it's meant to be humorous. And that in itself is quite important, that you're meant to, as a viewer, make up your own mind, really, about whether this is absolutely serious or not, rather than being told, laugh now, this is the kind of funny bit.
Well, I mean, and some of the work obviously isn't funny. And, I mean, one thinks of Revital Cohen's life support using animals as life support devices. And, for example, the greyhound to use its lungs to provide someone with oxygen. We actually had calls from the greyhound shelter who were very worried that we actually had a greyhound in the science gallery that was actually being used to basically as a life support machine. And that triggers all sorts of different reactions in people. And, there's a sense, is this condoning animal experimentation? No, how do you sort of negotiate that line?
Negotiators were in our work, or as teachers working with students who are developing it, or
yeah, well, I suppose both in your own work and then in the work of students who are exploring these areas around particularly on the not necessarily around the use of animals, but that obviously hits a particular nerve.
Yeah.
With
but people. I think with the Revital's project, when she started it, she went into the renal unit at one of the hospitals and sat down, and there's a beautiful video that she made which showed the machines that people are attached to, and the machines that people are the designers are actually designing these kinds of machines that keep people alive, and it was it was very difficult because people hadn't really talked to, even the nurses and the doctors hadn't really talked to people who have to attach themselves to these machines, and what it was really like to do that. So just the experience of talking to them, doing that video, and realising that this very different, strange relationship that people have with these machines that are keeping them alive. And so, she was saying, well, what do I do? Do I just design another machine? Or, how do I do this in a very different way? So it was quite a challenge. She made quite a leap to then think about animals. And she was doing other research about how the greyhound industry in the UK is a huge business of their products, and they only last for three years, and then they're kind of euthanized. And so there were all these funny connections she was making before she kind of made the connection between, well, what does it mean if animals could be like, she sort of looked at assistance pets that do help people. If they're blind, you get this wonderful companion, not a machine that kind of guides you through a city as like a robot. So the research was very, humane the way it kind of comes up. So it's difficult because the image in the show is quite a provocative image, and you can misread it immediately as being animal experimentation or something like that. When in fact it's an incredibly humane project about our relationship to animals and how we can have a more kind of richer, it's not just using the animal as a sort of a product.
But I think one of the things we're very conscious of is to not go for shock and to try and shock people, but to maybe provoke in a kind of a thoughtful way. And I think that comes up a lot in the development of these projects, to try and avoid sensationalism. It's a little bit like humour. It's hard to kind of draw the line and to position them more as a thoughtful provocation. And to do that, they have to be a little bit dramatic, but enough that you will engage with them. And I think it's also interesting that when the project was blogged a lot when it was done a couple of years ago, or a year ago, I think it was, and some people again took it literally as though a real animal had been used in this design project. I think it's one of the nice things about speculative design like this is they're almost like thought experiments. You're just posing an idea and letting people see it as though it's real and then imagine what the consequences might be. And sometimes when we meet with discuss this sort of stuff, I think in the context of art, people almost are disappointed that it isn't real, that it's just a posed photograph. And I think that does throw up a lot of interesting issues. And certainly from my perspective, I wouldn't be happy if a dog was being used, exploited as part of a design experiment. But I kind of like the idea of imagining a society where dogs are being used as part of these kinds of devices. And that sort of, again, those kind of contradictions I think are very interesting.
But it does raise the issue about what are the role of animals in our society anyway? And I think that's quite, if you start looking at, we eat them, there are all sorts of kind of, where's the limits of animal? And I think that kind of question is what this asks, not that we have any answers for it, but it sort of says, well, how far are we prepared to go, or where are the limits, and how do they connect with us? And I think a lot of that is interesting because one of the things that was surprising us about a lot of the projects when they started to appear in our with them all was this idea of going back to a natural. How do humans connect back into a natural connection with nature? Rather than changing the human. Rather than imposing all the time. So Susanna's project with the bees, our fertility, looking at perhaps, maybe we go back to a more kind of biological fertility where the bees help us to smell, our own breaths rather than using chemicals to change our bodies. So that was quite an interesting kind of change. There seems to be a great deal of interest with a lot of the work about how we kind of fit into a more natural kind, not natural, but more sort of biological kind of set of systems rather than. So that was I thought quite interesting.
I just want to come back on that. I mean, this question of speculative design, designing for possible futures rather than designing for present consumers, because I think that's a really interesting notion of design. And another quite provocative piece in the show is the work around the idea of having a pet pig, which is living in your home and which is growing your future lungs, and with the technology of xenotransplantation, allowing you to continue to smoke, to chain smoke in your house while your pig grows your future lungs, and giving you a mask to protect the pig from inhaling your passive smoke. That's pretty provocative, and I suppose when one thinks of that as a possible future scenario, you think, is that a place I want to live? Do I, is that something that I want the future to look like? And that seems to be a strong element of a lot of the work in this exhibition. It's almost kind of, it seems to me that it's trying to ask questions about how we need to behave in the present if we're to avoid certain future scenarios. Do you see a sort of precautionary aspect to this?
Definitely to some of the projects there is a kind of precautionary aspect. But there also, I guess, they're sort of trying to, on the one hand, address us individually and say, would we like that kind of a future, and how might you modify your individual behaviour or your views to avoid it if it's an unpleasant one. But there's a kind of implicit criticism of how technologies move out of laboratories into everyday life through the marketplace, and the mechanisms of the marketplace prioritise certain uses. You know, it is profit driven. It's technologically driven. If there's a market for it, it will exist. And so things like Elio's project with the passive smoking device for the pigs is a little bit cynical. And it's kind of saying, well, because of the sort of the way the technologies enter everyday life at the moment, there's no, you know, something like that sounds wrong. You know, it shouldn't exist. But the way that the markets just let all sorts of things that shouldn't exist enter into society, I think, is the problem there. So they can't really. It's difficult because they can't really fix the situation and kind of, I guess,
it's sort of suggesting, isn't it, that a gadget will save, you know, don't worry, if you just get a gadget and you can do what you like, you know, we can paste it all over using gadgets. But I mean, one of the things I think is a lot of the science that comes out doesn't think about the sort of laziness of people, or the fact that they, you know, don't want to behave perfectly, or they are irrational. You know, there's definitely, when science starts to come out, it's for the perfect citizen who behaves perfectly, and yet the world isn't like that. So I think that's another thing that Elio's picks up on. It's the fact that, you know, yes, we could have if that did happen, doesn't mean to say that people are going to behave perfectly. You know, they still probably think, well, why not? I can just keep smoking. I've got these lovely lungs there. You know, so I think that's where I think design plays a role, in that the ordinariness of the irrationality of people gets taken in, as well as, you know, that's accommodated as well. Not, as I say, not saying it's a good scenario, but that's probably one that probably will happen.
But Fiona, why are designers getting so interested in science now?
Why are designers getting interested in science?
Some designers.
Getting into science. I think in our experience, maybe that science seems so far away and so difficult to engage with. So when we started first looking at science and design, we were asking the question: could design participate in scientific ideas or not? You know, how could it participate in it? And it was an experiment, and we weren't sure whether designers would find it interesting or not. And Elio was one of the first kind of students who probably really kind of got into it in a big way. And I think there is a fact that you think it's so far away, it's so specialised. How on earth can a designer even begin to do anything, you know, speculative or anything in that space? So, but I think that gap has become narrowed in that the idea of making scenarios or bringing the science more into an ordinary, everyday kind of family orientated, even domestic, you know, to do with people and empathy kind of space is a space that designers are really good at. They're really good at how people use things, how people in their homes, what the relationships between people are. And so there's this huge gap between a really scientific idea and a kind of ordinary, everyday kind of living thing. And I don't know, it's I think bursting through the barrier of, well, yes, you could actually speculate in this space and create different kinds of future scenarios, is something that designers can do, and I think that's broken down now. So now, you know, you can't stop. You know, it's like it's opened up floodgates of, and there's just so many things. I think particularly now in the world, we're at an amazing time in terms of the things that are going on with genetics and neuroscience. There's just amazing kind of scientific things happening right now. And what we do with our students sometimes is, if they start a project, to keep them interested in what's happening in that world right now. So they could be reading a newspaper and they're doing the project, and immediately their project is in, you know, there's something actually happening with it now. It's a live science that's still being worked out. It's still trying to work out what's, you know, happening in that space, and that becomes very exciting, I think. Because of
is that a key thing for you, which is the engaging with the science at a point where it's still at the speculative, conjectural stage, where you still don't know exactly where the science is going to go? And whereas I suppose historically design would have engaged with science and technology more at a point where you've got your nice technology. Now, what kind of beautiful wrapping can we put onto it? Would that be fair
I
to
think
say?
that more and more, certainly we can see with the younger designers applying to the RCA, they're dissatisfied with the options available for designers. That one of sort of repackaging technology, making it more friendly or more consumable, and looking for something more meaningful to do, to kind of, I guess, look, and at the same time noticing the incredibly rapid rate of technological and scientific development at the moment, and especially with genetics, it's really impacting on what it means to be human, on the idea of nature, on biological systems. And there seems to be a space opening up where designers can say, well, actually, I can take my skills and use them to start to make some of the issues arising in the science world a lot more concrete and debatable. And so I think before, designers were always sort of, there was always a group of designers that would be critical of the mainstream role for design, but they didn't seem to be, I don't know why recently, working with the sort of implications of science is creating this sort of new opportunity for them. Why that is, I don't know, it's quite interesting. But some of them are still obviously not looking at sort of far future scientific developments, but also just thinking about how science could be incorporated into their work. I mean, Dot's coin flipping machine, for example, is just trying to take something that we assume is based on chance and randomness and exploring the physics in it. And the science in his case, I think, is just a lens to sort of open up a different way of thinking about an everyday activity. So all of the projects really are engaging with science in different ways, and using science in different ways as inspiration, dealing with the possible problems of it, or just as a way of seeing everyday opportunities. It's a very kind of rich space.
I think the other thing is, I think we're all a little bit geeky anyway. The kind of designers who are attracted to the space are a little bit geeky. So, kind of they really love those kinds of ideas of technology and future technologies. And
some of your work has a sort of poignant appeal to it as well. I mean, I'm thinking of the evidence dolls, for example, which are engaging with, I suppose, quite unproblematic science, because it's the idea of whether you can determine whether a lover would be genetically compatible. So it's the science is fairly well understood, but yet placing it in the context of the evidence doll, which maybe you could say a little bit about that project. As it certainly gives it a very different kind of social context.
Well, I think with that one, I think we were very interested to know what people thought of the genetic technologies. We were doing a lot of research about, what you could discover through. It was just actually when we did it. It was just after the Craig Venter had, done the code. So, and there was all these promises about, we've got now 1,000, markers. And he was promising, actually, that with these 1,000 markers, we could tell you what illnesses you were going to get if you were going to die. And we thought, wow, that's amazing. If you could find that out in advance, would that make you think differently about the person you're about, maybe you have a child with, or even that what I found was quite interesting, that you could find out what the future of their future health was going to be. So that, if as old age, what are you going to have to deal with? Would that make you think about your lovers in different ways? Would you choose differently for a woman? So I think that we had this kind of what I thought was quite an evil notion of sort of commodifying men down to just what they can give you biologically as products, and to see what other women thought about that.
I think we're also interested in how, rather than talking about it in very general terms, but zooming in on something like relationships and romance and marriage and having children, we could create maybe some different perspectives on that kind of debate about predictive gene testing. And the dolls, that's a slide of them at the moment actually, that they were meant to kind of literally focus the conversation on this thing that represents my boyfriend, and kind of we were using design to kind of just make it a lot more concrete, really, I think.
So that you would have, rather it being abstract, like a genetics, and would you change things in, as an abstract concept, a philosophical concept? We want people to think about their lives with their partners, in their homes, with these dolls. How would they think about those people they know? differently, not some abstract idea, but them in their relationships and, their lives, how they might think about that and their decision-making processes. So that was a very strong part of it, rather than a very, very abstract idea of just genetics and these markers. And
didn't you actually workshop that with single women?
We did, yeah.
And how did that go?
It was quite fascinating. It was actually that's why you do these kinds of things, because the imaginations are fantastic, and the way that people have very, very different stories and very, and bring up ideas that we might not have thought about ourselves. So, for example, what was really nice is that a lot of the ladies constantly contradicted themselves all the way through the interviews. So they'd say, no, I wouldn't change anything genetically. If I could, you have to have something natural. You just haven't. You shouldn't interfere. But the minute you bring in another question, another way round, where you could actually change a few things, and it wasn't so expensive. Of course, they all wanted to change things. It was a bit like that. And then there was times when one of the ladies said to us about, when you're in your 20s, you'll get together with your girlfriends and you'll giggle in the bedroom and drink wine and have fun. But then you said, but when you're in your 30s and you're thinking about your fertility, she said, I want it in stainless steel, I want a refrigerator, I want to be total in control of my fertility. That's what kind of this was about. It was about sort of finding out what people really thought about these technologies and how they kind of would affect their lives.
Which ties in with another piece in the show, actually, the artificial body clock, our artificial biological clock, right? Which is
Revatel's piece.
A wonderful piece. But do you ever get a backlash from other designers against this idea of designing for the future, rather than designing for the real needs of real living consumers?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not so much about the future, because a strong part of industrial design and interaction design is speculating on the future. But those futures are a sort of a continuation of how things are now, and how design will almost ensure that things continue as they are now. But as soon as you look at alternative futures and how things might be, some people do get upset by that, and they kind of see it as pointless because it's unlikely to happen according to today's values and systems. It's perceived as maybe a waste, which is exactly the reason why we do it, to kind of question today's values and assumptions. That's another reason why I think we insist on presenting it as design as well, because going back to the thing earlier about provocation and shock, we were in a conversation a couple of years ago with some artists about design and subversion and art and subversion. And their big criticism of design was it wasn't subversive enough. And of course we were saying, well, if it's too shocking, it's going to alienate the viewers and alienate the audience. It's going to seem too fantastical. And this kind of more low-key provocation, I think, is very important. But it definitely... It does cause problems in certain design contexts.
Is there a risk that perhaps, obviously, you've exhibited in MoMA and, the museums and galleries embrace this kind of work and, we love it. But then, the academic community also embraces it. But is there a danger that the people who might most benefit from engaging with it, namely industry, might see it as something that's marginal or irrelevant to what they do?
I don't think so. I think that designers have more of a problem
with
it than industry. We work a lot with researchers in companies like Intel and Microsoft and the telecoms industry, but they often come from anthropological or computer science or other areas, and they can see this as a form of research. It's testing out ideas, but it's using the language of design, and therefore offers another way of going about doing research. But within design, there seems to be more friction, because I think it's seen as design almost your job is to design for industry, to make sure that things get into the marketplace, and this is what you do. And the minute you step outside of that, people are uncomfortable with it. So I think there's almost more receptivity to it within industry than there is within design.
But I think also that it's more going to be, and there's glimmers of it, that some of the way that this work is being perceived from an industrial point of view is it's very strategically based as opposed to very object-based. There's a lot of kind of infrastructure overview, kind of standing back, thinking that's going on within these projects. They're not just about the product, it's about the product within a broader context and system. And so I think this idea of strategic designers as strategic thinkers is something that I think could emerge a lot stronger than it does now, because it is seen that, you know, design isn't seen that way as much as it perhaps could be.
Okay, I'm going to open up quite soon to the floor, but I was wondering, you know, people sometimes think of this as connected with science fiction, or, you know, with the work of people like Margaret Atwood and so on. They see this work as sometimes you know, connected with that space. But I mean, I wonder if you could talk about how exactly it relates with science fiction.
I think there's a number of different relationships, really. A term that's kind of becoming more common within design, I think, design, at least academic design recently, is kind of design fiction, the idea of designs that are almost like literary fiction. They're just about ideas. And I think, well, if you look at architecture, there's hundreds of years of a tradition of people making speculative proposals for cities, for buildings, for fantastical buildings, and so on. And I think we're trying to shift design practice into that kind of a space where it's accepted that you can speculate as a designer, and not everything has to end up in production and part of everyday life. But as soon as you add technology to the mix, it naturally gets connected with sci-fi and sort of film props and things like that. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem, as long as people are engaging at least with the ideas behind it.
I think that there is this whole thing about the boundary between reality and fiction, and how far do we go? And because we have a lot of discussion, a lot of the discussions in the college is about, oh, that's too fantastical, oh, that's too realistic. You know, how far do we go to make something powerful, but it has to have some kind of gravity to it, it has to have some real facts and ideas in it, but equally it can't be so kind of grounded to the real that it becomes a bit mundane. It has to kind of push your imagination, twist your imagination. So a lot of the teaching going on is about balancing between, you know, how far do you push the imagination and how much do you ground it in the two, and what all those mixes are. So a lot of that's the crafting that goes on with a lot of the scenarios that come up that you see in the gallery here, is about that balance.
I suppose even sort of outside the realm of design, there's a whole sort of industry around forecasting and future scenarios, and there's you know, you have your policy think tanks, you have you know, places like the Institute for the Future, and all of these places which are you know, conjuring up possible future scenarios. You have you know, these deliberative games that are used, looking at scenarios brought about through nanotechnology or xenotransplantation and so on. And you know, it seems like that's a whole other dimension to this work, potentially. And so, you know, are the Pentagon calling you guys to help with anything, or?
No,
not yet. But I think the idea that we're going into all these crises at the moment, with financial crisis, ecological crisis, you know, suddenly we can't just say, oh, the existing systems are working. You know, suddenly we have to think, well, they're obviously not working, so we've got to start thinking very differently. And I think that's something, you know, again, this idea of thinking strategically more and more kind of cleverly about resources and financial systems and things like that. So I do think this is the right time for this kind of thinking.
But I think one of the things design might be able to bring is that it's sort of, you know, rather than addressing us as citizens and kind of having debates about what's right and wrong, it kind of orientates the argument towards us as consumers. And that's not to trivialize it, but just to say that's how we often engage. We make these decisions based on how much something costs. We buy that particular service or technology. And by doing that, it kind of enters into everyday life and has whatever impact it's going to have. So by presenting these kinds of ideas that could be presented as films, as short stories, as in other media, as hypothetical products, I think we're trying to connect with our consumer side and highlight how complex some of these decisions are. We can't just think as citizens about what's right and wrong, but we're also consumers. And by buying things, the world takes shapes around us. So I think that's one of the areas that design can contribute that maybe some of the other types of disciplines working in this space don't really address.
It seems to me that there's another underlying theme throughout a lot of the work, which is reconfiguring of social and emotional relationships, whether it's love or whether it's your relationship with your pet, or whether, you know, it seems that a lot of what you and the other designers in the show are thinking about is reimagining relationships. I mean, you know, whether it's the evidence dolls, or whether it's the, you know, using smell to find a future partner, or Revital's work with the, you know, the companionship of a dialysis machine. So, you know, what's really underlying that reconfiguring of relationships? Also, even one work which isn't in this show, which I think is fascinating, is this, you know, when you reimagine the family as a unit, not obsessed with property speculation, but as we have been in Ireland for many years, but obsessed with hydrogen production. So, you know, if we shift to a hydrogen economy, how would that affect, you know, young Jenny, who has to produce 20 litres of hydrogen per week in order to receive her pocket money? I think it's really interesting the way you're, you know, reimagining those personal relationships.
I think that comes from the design area we all work in. Most of us have somehow come through a kind of interaction design space, and interaction design, you know, it sounds funny to describe it traditionally, but it's all about designing relationships to technology, how technology links people remotely and so on, and thinking a lot about the emotional and the human side and the softer side. And then when you actually spend a lot of time thinking about that professionally and practically, and then you kind of move into a more speculative space, I think you still bring that sensitivity towards human relations to the topic. And so most of the designers aren't so interested in form and shape or production technologies, but by its nature, interaction design is interested in relationships between people, love, romance, intimacy, empathy, all these kinds of things. And so it's a really interesting point, actually. But I think there would be other groups of designers that would be responding to science as a way of generating new kinds of forms and new types of materials and structures, as a lot of architects do, for example. But this group, I think, are very attuned to human relations and the impact that technology can have on that side of things.
Great. Well, I think that this might be an appropriate point to open it up to the floor, if any of you might have questions or even thoughts or comments on works that you've seen in the exhibition that you're reacting to. Are there any questions from the floor? Over here, yeah?
You talked about consumers shaping society through what they choose and making decisions about right and wrong. But do you think designers have an ethical responsibility with regards to what they create? I mean, should they self-censor, or do they get to take an objective, amoral stance like a documentary filmmaker might? Is it up to society to reject or accept their offerings, or do you think that by what they produce, designers are normalising certain behaviours through, like by facilitating them through products?
I think that that's a really interesting point, because I think there's two forms of design. I think in real design, the design that happens in industry, the one that's creating all the products, the design has very, very little power, and it's part of a big system. And I don't think it is the designer's choice to push certain technologies or not. I think they're just playing a part. And that's why I think there's a need for this speculative parallel form of design, where the designer is an independent professional who still might be working in industry, but another part of their role is to try to raise some of these issues and debates and present those more problematic design proposals into a public setting where they can be debated. And when they do that, like a lot of work in this show, I don't necessarily think it has to reflect their individual morals. And they're sort of saying, you know, I could see how this misuse of neuroscience research could lead to a kind of really dark society. Let's do a design proposal to bring it to life and see what other people think. And I think actually there's very few in there that are probably saying, this is the kind of society I would absolutely want to have. But I think that often in the debate around this kind of work, people assign far too much power to designers, and sadly, I think they just don't have it. It isn't the designer's choice, and that's why it's us almost as shoppers and consumers that can shape the world around us by rejecting certain products and saying, I don't want to buy this particular technology, because of the potential consequences it might have. And designers can play a part in highlighting those potential consequences, which inform us as consumers. But I don't see why a designer can't kind of be in both worlds either. It's just like architects can build buildings and work in that, existing economic systems, but they can also be speculating and publishing books and putting stuff in exhibitions to raise issues.
Do we have any other questions, comments, or reactions?
One problem, which seems to be one of the greatest that we face, is the problem of population. And so many of the ideas that we have here are really showing us how to enable a greater population by survival in one way or another, or by increasing age and all the rest of it. Nature has all sorts of devices for producing population control, like plagues and all the rest of it. And is there a possibility that if we continue with this very interesting and intelligent and creative form of design, that nature, on the other hand, will be working in the opposite direction, finding new ways of threatening us as a result of
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think both of us agree with you that population growth is one of the origins of so many of the problems facing us, and it's well beyond the scope of design to address. Unfortunately, it's down to, I guess, us as individuals. But I think it's a really interesting point that not all, there are designs here, I suppose Michael Burton's projects about reintegrating ourselves back into nature and embracing dearth and microorganisms and so on. It's definitely about somehow extending ourselves as a race into the future, but at a cost where we have to also lose a little bit maybe of our dignity. But I don't think that's an issue in a lot of the other projects. Maybe they're not thinking far enough ahead to anticipate a thriving expansion of the human race as a result of their projects, and therefore what the counter-reaction from nature might be to thwart them. But I don't know what you think.
I think that would be a subject matter that could definitely be on the cards. It wouldn't surprise me if there will be some projects that start to emerge that challenge this idea of, what can we do in this kind of crisis, and the idea of and kind of bringing a focus on the idea of overpopulation.
It's quite interesting too. It's come up several times in student projects, and it's always been a difficult one to. It's probably where the limits of design are to turn into design, and it's one that obviously turns up a lot in literature and cinema as well. I'm thinking of a short story by Ballard where someone can't have a child until someone else dies. And it's all about the legal systems and the monitoring and the kind of almost the protocols that would facilitate and maintain such a system. And it's something that the designers that we know, when they've tried to tackle that issue, it hasn't really, they've kind of ended up steering away from it. It seems it's definitely beyond design.
At the moment.
Any other questions or comments from the floor? Linda.
I said a question before.
Sorry. You can go next. Go, yeah.
I went to a question about one of the pieces you were talking about, the one, I think it's Elio Cacciavelli's products for your pig, and you spoke about it as something kind of cynical, that you'd keep on chain smoking and just have a pig to kind of solve the problems for you. I personally, when I saw it, I thought it was one of my favourite ones for a very different reason, and I don't know if you felt that was a factor in it as well, that there was something very caring and humane about it, in that instead of, obviously the idea of xenotransplantation, that's kind of, whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not sure, but the idea that if you were having a pig for your organs, that you wouldn't just pick it off some kind of battery farm, that you would have it in your own home, and you would take care of it, and you'd have toys for it, and that you'd have a radio transmitter so you could listen to make sure it was having a good time. Do you think that was a factor in the design of that as well?
Oh, that was the factor.
The side of it, of just keeping smoking.
It's the selfishness. So, exactly, because they're you wouldn't take the pigs into your home today, because that would be a much better way for pigs to live and to give them toys and to nice food and to adjust our home so that animals could live with us, only for that reason of improving their quality of life. But once they become utility pets, and they're, say, growing our kidneys or lungs or whatever, now they're valuable to us again. So we bring them into our home, give them toys to make sure they're healthy, make sure they don't suffer from passive smoking, purely so that when we take their organs, we're getting the best possible organs we can. So it's meant to be purposefully, as I understand it anyway, sort of ambiguous in that sense, and highlight this kind of very complicated relationship we have with the natural world, that it's just not black and white.
We've time for a few more questions. Linda, I think you had.
I think I have a bit of a very half-formed comment, but you actually made me think about this. If you look at what was happening in the health debates in the US, you ended up at one stage having a whole country and newspapers and media discussing this notion of death boards, where a group of people would sit around and select, well, your time to die now, and this became part of mainstream discussion and a huge part of what was supposed to be a serious debate about health. And likewise, in recent referenda we've gone, I think more and more people are talking about kind of unrealistically strange outcomes that kind of capture and take over the discussions we have. And I just wonder, is there a role for some of the design you do in kind of saying, okay, some people might look at this and go, that'll never happen, but nonetheless, we're willing to have, I suppose, hijack serious things in thinking of odd things. As I said, this is a very half-formed idea, but the way that we can actually be very, very speculative, and it suddenly becomes real because it's presented in one context. But when you present it in the design context, we can kind of go, oh no, that'll never become real. And I wonder, is there some way of kind of linking that to make people kind of look at what we are debating and discussing now a little bit more, and what that means, if you can understand what I'm trying to ask in that.
I think it's, one of the things that I guess we're more interested in is exploring the methods and ways of going about doing this and how designers can operate like this. But one of the things we're not addressing is how to go beyond that and interface with other types of organizations and systems that bring it to a much broader sort of audience and maybe does leave design behind and start to give rise to some of the kind of spreading of ideas that you're talking about. But I know for a fact that some of our graduates, that's absolutely what they're interested in. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how, once they go out into the real sort of systems, that their ideas might start to impact and fuse and join up with other sort of people and experts in other disciplines and start to leave the design bit behind and kind of hopefully contribute to much bigger and more interesting debates. But, I mean, it's kind of a conscious limitation in what we're doing, that we're interested almost at working further upstream of what are the tools that designers can use, how would they do them, and doing kind of experiments to test them out. But
so could you do experiments on a death board?
But the very idea that it exists, I think, is fantastic. Yeah. The idea that a set of kind of policies have transformed and been twisted around, and there's a logic, and then you end up with this thing that you think, well, how on earth did we get to that? And the whole thing about reality and what's real and what's fictional. Sometimes you look at what's out there and you think, my God, how did that happen? So that keeps us going, because sometimes the reality is much more extreme than the fiction that you could even come up with. And so, we do keep our eyes on the crazy decision-making processes that are over-rationalised. And that's kind of, I think, a thing that we definitely keep our eyes on and open for, because it's, very rich material in the real world.
Are there any more questions from the floor?
Thanks. First of all, thank you very much for bringing the exhibition to Dublin. It's excellent. I particularly like the humour of it. But I'd just like to make one comment. I think it stems from what everybody's saying today, is that unfortunately, one of your points was that it takes 10 years for a lot of technology to come to the market. And at that time, it's actually when it's been, actually thrown out of the laboratory or whatever. But I do think, because of in light of the current world we live in, with regulatory boards like the FDA and now ethical bodies, that sometimes these bold, brave technology advances never get to the forum that they should. Whereas if you were to work in parallel to that in a completely different entity and to never kind of embrace the design engineer kind of role, that you could develop as society changes, because some of these shifts, as you said, are very forward thinking and they're not for now, but if you could develop them alongside the likes of medical device industry, etc., that's a place that I think that some of these may come to fruition.
Thank you. Perhaps more of a comment than, or do you want to respond? Or,
I fundamentally agree, because I think this is all new for us. We've really been experimenting with this probably for the last 4 years, fairly intensively. And each year we're discovering new organizations and new areas and new people who see a value in this and want to kind of collaborate and develop things together. And it's still early days, and so we can see ways it could sort of have an impact beyond the narrow world of design, definitely. But it seems it's just going to take time to build up relationships ourselves and with our department, but also with our graduates. But I feel, I agree with what you're saying, and I feel also very optimistic that these kinds of things will happen.
But we're currently talking with Imperial College and Cambridge University about within their synthetic biology departments, and it's quite interesting. And we want to have a relationship between thinking about this new technology and what it actually means. But it's quite interesting when we sit down to start discussing future scenarios, they immediately can get very dark very quickly, and yet there's some very positive and some amazing kind of ways in which the scenarios can go. So one level you can really see it being clamped down almost like immediately, but then because there's so much modelling going on, I can see quite a healthy debate about modelling futures going on. We're enabling to make decision making before this stuff kind of really gets going in a very kind of healthy way, But this is something I think we're particularly...
But equally, there's a sort of a potentially negative role where it can become a sort of propaganda for certain scientific research and make us comfortable with the idea of it before it even happens. And I think the thing that's important is to have many, many, many visions and speculations, so that the particularly evil ones and the particularly utopian ones can be seen as parts of a spectrum. But at the moment, that's still not happening. You get one, as you were saying, Linda, things get picked up in the press, and a particularly dark manifestation of an idea gets seized upon and spread. And it's trying to, I guess, create an environment where there can be many possible futures, and they can all be debated. That is the goal, really.
But I think it is getting more complex. The complexity is getting more, it's more contradictory. For example, there's a whole thing going on with GM crops at the moment, where biologists are actually engineering sort of sustainable, well, not sustainable, but a kind of a way of the crops being much more ecological by modifying them than using kind of fertilizers and actually trashing the planet through using fertilizers, but doing it in a biological way that's actually more... so it contradicts this idea about GM. So it all gets a bit more complicated. You think, well, actually, that's a genetically modified thing, but actually, it's actually better for the planet than what we're doing already with all the fossil fuels. And that, we're going to have to think about that more. It's not just this is bad, that's good. It's going to be weighing up of value systems, more kind of complex ideas that we're going to have to really think about. And I think that's far more interesting than just being oppositional all the time to things. We have to be more smart about the decisions we make.
More creative ones, because you have to be analytical and work in that environment. So that's where I think that the two just coexist parallel. That's the ideal.
But there's going to be constant trade-offs, and those will be discussed, as well. I mean, it's going to be complex decisions that are made as opposed to just straightforward economic ones. So, and I think that's actually a positive thing, because we might make more intelligent kind of decisions.
The point that was made about this idea of possibly propaganda for science or desensitizing people to, potentially exploitative aspects of emerging technology. That's a criticism that's sometimes been made of some artists, like Stellark, for example, who is a body artist and who works with having maybe ingesting a sculpture and endoscopy as art and so on, and so sometimes people will make that criticism that really, in a way, he's the sort of the vanguard of all sorts of invasive technological or medical practices. Is that something that you're kind of concerned about with regard to your own work?
Yes, but I think
we always
numbing
want
people to.
No, I think in the end, one of the things that we're constantly aware of, and one thing we're frightened of, as a result of that, we constantly try and make sure it has a social context at which it sits, so that it's not just isolated from some technological thing you're just doing. So it is difficult to know all the facts and ideas, and you can't always sort of, I think what we try and do is try and create, what's the word? Things that don't fit. There's bits that really work and others that don't, and it's a kind of contradiction. So the best solutions are one that embodies a contradiction of two things where you have to you're not sure which one's the right way. One, you think, that's that, I really want that. And others saying, but if I did that, I'm going to have that. And so you have a contradiction. It's not a solution. It's not saying this is good, this is bad. It's sort of saying, there's a trade-off, there's a set of values, and we have to work out what it is. And I think that's how we get out of that. There's always it's not straightforward. There's always a contrast that's going to pull the carpet away, and
So another question here.
Hi. I think in many respects you've already answered the question, but I wonder if you could just address it directly, because you're both teachers, and Fiona, earlier on in the talk, when you talked about teaching, you put it in inverted brackets.
All right.
So I just wonder, the speculative design that you're engaged in obviously changes the crafting of the design problem and the crafting of the design solution to that problem. So I just wonder, to what extent do you have to reintroduce different techniques in the kind of pedagogy of design? And do you?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
We teach a 2-year MA, so the students already have some backgrounds, primarily art and design, but sometimes also engineering or economics or psychology or other areas. And the first year consists of about 6 projects and some workshops where we almost deconstruct the sort of assumptions about how you design, looking at different roles for designers, different methodologies or methods, different kinds of possibilities. And at the end of first year, the designers then write a dissertation where they sort of reflect and almost reassemble their individual idea of design, which in second year they go on to test out to a number of projects, either one massive project or a number of smaller ones, sort of orientated to how they'd like to go on after college. And it's the first year is all about definitely trying to, it's not, I think Fiona put teaching in inverted commas because we're not trying to transmit a kind of an existing set of knowledge or instructions because we don't know ourselves, but we're trying to instead open up spaces and create a feeling of confidence and experimentation and risk-taking, where out of that people can almost develop their own individual ways of working. So we end up sort of with 16 graduates a year, but hopefully 16 quite different ways of going about doing stuff.
But what we're finding, I think, now is we're getting very different, our intake and the ambition, they're bringing in stuff and they want to do new methodologies that we haven't even thought about, and we're thinking, I don't know, we'll just have to see where this goes. So it is very experimental space, and especially in the last year, and I guess this year's coming, we're going to areas that we're kind of old-fashioned designers, but they're sort of going off in places that we as ourselves personally would probably never go. But because that's the way they're thinking about things, there are different methodologies coming up. So I see it more like a lab in that we are. That's why I think we've got a lot involved with science in many ways, because it is kind of a lab where there are experiments going on, and certain people are taking experiments in a certain way and bringing up very different things that we hadn't thought of before. So it's kind of in progress still. Do
we have one final question? Yeah.
Yeah, so my question kind of relates to what Tim just said. As designers, we're trained to think in a very sort of a problem-solving way. So we go identify problems, and it's a kind of a convergent process whereby in the end we have this the best possible solution. And I think in order to come up with this kind of speculative work that you're doing, it requires a very different way of thinking, because really you're not finding solutions, you're posing questions at the end. And so I think the thought process has to be very different. And I'm wondering, do you have difficulties with that as practitioners and as teachers? And have you got ways of coping with that?
Well, that's exactly, what you just said is dead right. That's what we are doing. And when we're taking students onto the course, that's a very important part. We actually set a mini project that students spend a couple of days on, where we try to identify, are they comfortable with going into very open spaces and having to, as you say, not solve problems or find solutions, but speculate and propose something that will hopefully make us think differently. And we look for that in their portfolios, in their descriptions about why they want to come to the course in this particular project they do, and then in a pretty thorough interview. And still, sometimes when people come onto the course, we realise they just want to solve problems. And so over the first year, we go through a process of working with them to, again, loosen that up a little bit. I think there's an important thing to that. Sometimes people think, if you turn away designers, especially from problem solving, you're somehow leaving design behind. And I think the reason we're doing that is that the sort of problems we're facing now in some cases are so complex and so massive and so extreme that there maybe aren't any solutions. And designers want to more and more get involved with these big problems and sort of save the planet in a sense. And I think what we're trying to say is, well, maybe it's about also changing ourselves as humans, changing our attitudes and values and behaviors. And so these kinds of speculations are addressed at that side of things, of trying to impact on how we think of ourselves.
So once you sort of change the focus of what the problem is that you're going to solve, it's not a normal problem, then the problem solving really, really comes into its own, because the details, I always think that the design detail is where all the issues are. If you start to, like in our evidence styles, it's little penis drawer, it's right down to the point where that's where you keep the sample in the drawer, and it's that kind of detail that its focus is, it's embodied in the object. So that kind of tangibility equally has to be there too. So I think we still problem solve very much.
The problem solving is part of a bigger process, I guess.
I'd just like to ask you a final question, which is, we've developed this exhibition. You've come and brought all these wonderful people to the Science Gallery, and and you're going to head off this afternoon or tomorrow back to London. But what would we like to emerge from this? What would we like this to spark off?
Collaborations.
Yeah.
A kind of all sorts of people thinking, actually, design is more interesting than just problem solving and creating products that we all want to buy. But hopefully people can see, actually, it'd be interesting to team up with designers and create new kinds of projects. And whether it's a political scientist or a science scientist or an ordinary person or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that science doesn't really understand what designers can do for them. And I think in the end, the discussions we're having with Imperial, and it's interesting because we're in a box. Designers it's the artists do expression things. They don't realise that designers actually are huge strategic people who can kind of bring people together and facilitate a lot of things, as well as kind of creative processes. So they're incredibly practical people, although they might have these other things. So I think, I would love it if there were, more collaborations between designers and scientists on these kinds of projects. That's what we want to happen.
Great.
And that's why I think we're very excited about showing the show here, because again, I love the fact that you say we're not a museum. We're this active space. We're trying to link these different people together. It's a kind of meeting point of minds where you're breaking down boundaries between the the scientists and the designers, and saying, this is a new kind of space. What can we do in here? Let's do projects together, or build in projects where this kind of thinking can happen. So that's what we want to happen.
So if anyone is interested, if there are any scientists or designers in the audience, we have both a kind of a high tech and a low tech approach. We have on every piece in the exhibition, there's a Twitter hashtag, so you can comment about it on Twitter. You can express your thoughts about it, or else if you prefer a sort of lo-fi solution, you can use a card. We have like what if cards, and you can scroll your ideas and leave them in the cafe. Please, I would, if you haven't already seen it already, I'd encourage you to go and have a proper look around the exhibition. And I would just like to thank Tony and Fiona, not only for the wonderful discussion today, but really for the past few months of working with the Science Gallery to put together this show. And it's been an incredibly stimulating process. So thanks so much for getting involved. Thank you.
Thank you.